I'm Allen Farmelo. I'm a record maker, and I also founded and direct the record label Butterscotch Records. Since Carolina and Christopher were coming to New York, we thought, let's try and make a record together. And as we started to imagine what that record could be like, we did the typical thing that one does when making a classical record of looking at repertoire. And as we explored repertoire that Carolina had played and stuff that she hadn't played, I found myself reaching for something else. And I heard that something else in a very particular piece on one of her records, which turned out to be an improvised piece. And I also learned that Christopher worked largely as a composer on piano by improvising and then taking what he had played and kind of cutting and pasting that together into his compositions. So there was improvisation and composition work hand in hand anyways, and we don't think about that so much because we treat the finished composition as a fixed thing. But we forget that at one point it was never fixed at all. It was just part of somebody making it up. So you can make it up in slow time, which is composition, or you can make it up in real time, which is improvising. So they're really, improvising and composing are just two ends of a continuum of how long it takes you to get there, I think. You know, some composers from the last century implied that improvisation would cause a performer to fall into habits where they're repeating motifs, working from muscle memory and other forms of habit that are not drawing on the conscious will of the composer as much, and therefore considered improvisation to be a lower form of composition, if you will. And I just think that from Coltrane forward, that whole concept was thrown in the trash. A lot of people hear the word improvisation and they immediately think of jazz because in America, the grand tradition of improvising has been jazz. This record doesn't fall into the stylistic category of jazz in any way that I can hear. And the two players do not have a background in jazz, even though both of them are versed in it and can play in it. The instincts that they're drawing on seem much less genre-bound on this record. And Christopher's playing in particular seems to draw on a sense of harmony and counterpoint that feels much closer to classical piano composition than it does to any jazz playing. And Carolina does not seem to draw on any jazz motifs at all on this record. I think the only relationship it might have to jazz is that it is improvised, that it is quote-unquote free, and that the pieces don't necessarily begin and end in an organized fashion. So it shares a sense of anarchy, improvisation, spontaneity with a lot of what we would call free jazz, but I don't feel that stylistically this record goes anywhere near that. popular culture has had a real way with instruments in terms of stereotyping them. Not just the instrument itself visually, but the sound of the instrument as well, and the genres of music that are associated with those instruments. Famous examples include the banjo. Once that went into Bonnie and Clyde and then Deliverance, that instrument was, through Hollywood's treatment, bound to a certain stereotypical interpretation by anyone who came into contact with it. Somewhere around the late 40s, this started to happen with the theremin. And we associate the theremin with ghosts, with UFOs, with science fiction in general, horror movies. We associate it with the Beach Boys specifically, with Good Vibrations. We associate it with Star Trek very specifically. And there's even an episode, I think, of the Brady Bunch in which the theremin makes an appearance as they're playing around, showing it. I think it's either a ghost or a UFO in the sky. And so the theremin got trapped in America as being not serious. Campy reference to spectralness and to, aliens approaching. And I think that those stereotypes are really unfortunate because it's limited how people perceive the instrument. I think it's really limited how people approach and learn to play the instrument, which is that they don't mostly approach and learn to play the instrument. So what's really exciting about releasing this record is that it is taking those stereotypes and just brushing them off and setting them aside entirely and presenting the instrument in a completely unexplored light as a genuine tool of expression. For me, one of the things that sets this record apart is that there is a darkness to the music that I think is fairly undeniable. And that darkness came into the music largely because Christopher and Carolina and I were standing on a street corner in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, walked away from that corner, and just moments later, a car swerved onto the corner and pinned two young children underneath it, and one of them died. And we didn't witness the accident, but we went to lunch, and when we came out of lunch, where we'd been discussing making the record, we came back to true horror at that corner and at the scene of that crime. And it was, my whole neighborhood was grieving, and it's unthinkable what happened. And it really affected all of us, and there's no question that we carried that into the studio and that it shows up in the music. I think that Carolina allowed her own experience of that horrible moment to seep into the record slowly. She didn't come out and make a grand gesture in honor of that, but allowed that darkness to creep into just about all the playing on the record. And I think in our choice of artwork, Tom Reed Dodge's log cabin holds a kind of explosive darkness, a frozen moment of explosiveness, which is a lot of his work seems to have in it, feels emblematic of that moment in time when something horrible happens and it gets frozen and it stays with you. And I think the artwork on this record was chosen very much with that in mind. My role as producer, their role as the musician or the improviser, my assistant John's role as the engineer or the assistant engineer, me as the mixer. And we're looking at a hierarchy here. You have the producer, you have the mixer, probably below that, you have the engineer, and the musician can be anywhere or maybe off to the side. And you have these hierarchies that define the way the work is going to be done, that define the relationships that are going to exist in the studio, which is going to then impact what gets made, not just how it gets made. And on an improvisatory album, that can determine the entire project. A different set of relationships, you're going to wind up with a completely different record on the other end. So I was very careful to make sure that we kind of knocked down the hierarchies. I didn't want me to be the producer who called all the shots. I didn't want them to be the musicians who were telling the engineer just to capture in a documentary fashion what they played. And I didn't want the studio to become a place of sort of stagnant role-playing, but a place of exploring roles and exploring relationships in an egalitarian way. And that started to happen in a really interesting way, which was that after getting in, setting up, and recording for a little while, we had a moment where I said, "Can I try throwing a couple ideas at you?" Then I wrote the words "A Whale in Love" on a piece of paper, photocopied it and brought the two pieces of paper in and set it down for them. And it led to the most wonderful improvisation. It opened up a whole way of working together that I could bring to them an image, an idea, almost like a small poem, something to contemplate that they then could work out together as improvisers on the instruments. And "A Whale in Love" makes it on the record. And the next one, I believe, was "Earth and Sky." And I had asked Christopher to be the earth and Carolina to be the sky. And they played that one. That made it onto the record. And all of the song titles on the record come from these 8x10 pieces of paper in which I'd written these things. And those pieces of paper, by the end, I think we had 30, 40 or more of them ready for them to draw from. So while they were playing or we were taking a break, I just wrote out more of them. Very free associative, very precognitive ideas for things, I think things like, a Rothko on fire, or a purple car speeding down a red highway, or "You Can't Dance to This," or any of these things. And some of the most successful pieces on the record probably wouldn't have come up if we hadn't been working in this way. And I think that way of working together felt very egalitarian. It didn't feel like they were out there playing and I was inside the control room recording. It felt like we were creating something that was different than all three of us. It wasn't the three of us doing our thing, it was all three of us doing something else, which was making the record. And when that sort of subtle metaphysical distinction happens, where the thing that you're making takes on its own form in the studio while you're making it, that's a really great shift. That's a really wonderful place to come to, because you fall into a groove as a collaborative team and the hierarchies fall away and everyone kind of understands their role and begins to play it and brings out excellence in everybody. And we really hit that moment pretty early on in the session, and we're able to surf that right through to the end when Carolina almost fell on the floor in exhaustion. And they just gave it their all. So those pieces of paper and a Sharpie went a long way toward breaking down the typical hierarchies. And by the end, I didn't feel like a producer, and I don't think they felt like musicians. I think we all felt like record makers. We were in there doing that together. It felt very good.